This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. Hi. What do you guys want to talk about? This is such good shit. Thanks, guys. Back to you.
Well, we'll see how this one goes. I think I underestimated how much time it was going to take to actually sit down and watch all these shows this week. I had a lot to say about that Great American Bash pay-per-view. Normally I like to ease into these things with the small talk, but I think I'm just going to hit the ground running and blast through the intros here. Folks, you are tuning into the 5 Starr Wrestling Report. We are on YouTube and Rumble on Mondays and Fridays for new shows and new content. Our Friday shows feature the designated classic reviews. So if you are into classic content and you're a big fan of the territories in particular, these are definitely going to be the shows for you. It is amazing as I've been tracking the progress we've made by going through these archives and, well, me just realizing how much crap I've totally forgotten about over the years. All this time, I thought I was a wrestling savant. I mean, I like to think I'm at least well-rounded to some degree. But these shows have given me a lot of perspective. I still remember how much I strongly disliked the booking of the 88 Bash pay-per-view in Baltimore. That I will never forget. I think my running gag with that show going forward will be, if you like seeing the bad guys reign supreme, boy, do I have the pay-per-view for you. If I didn't know any better, I'd have figured a 2010 version of Vince McMahon was booking that thing. Any and all attempts to screw over the fans and make them leave on a dour note. That show tried on all accounts to do so. And it more than likely succeeded. So on that note, may as well just get right into this thing. I'm already leaving you with enough teasers. Now, before we dive in head first and talk about the Great American Bash pay-per-view, I always like to try to provide a little bit of historical context when we cover the bigger events. Small little particulars that I may have neglected to mention while we were running down the studio programs for the Saturday syndicated shows. And I think one thing that really jumps out above all else, when you're talking about the Great American Bash from 1988, it is technically the final pay-per-view they run under the Crockett banner. Because remember, the next big pay-per-view event that WCW runs, that's Starrcade. And that's in December. Because I think 88 was the year where they pushed it back a month, right? By that point, Crockett had already sold to Turner. So in a way, I guess you could kind of call this the end of an era for the Crockett pay-per-view regime. Obviously, we've been covering the eventual sale of the company to the Turner Network later in November, I think it was. But I don't think we really talked about this Bash pay-per-view being the final landmark event under the Crockett name. Pretty big deal. They also taglined the event, "The Price for Freedom," which I do not remember being a selling point on the studio shows. If they did have a tagline, they certainly did not plug it. So we open with the World Tag Team Championship match. It's Tully and Arn defending against the challengers of Sting and Nikita Koloff. Or as Gary Capetta called him, Nakita Koloff. Watching these old classic shows from the big arenas, I can never stress enough how crazy and rowdy these people could get. I don't care what anybody says. It is a completely different kind of audience compared to what you see in today's product. And nowadays, the fans are constantly trying to hijack shows with their obnoxious singing and just making it impossible to enjoy what's happening in the ring. Unless you drown it out entirely. These fans are just happy to see a heel get their ass kicked. God, you want to talk about heels getting whipped. Tully and Arn got their asses handed to them in this match. For basically the entire 20-minute Broadway. Spoiler for the finish. We'll get to that. Seriously, though, I don't think Tully and Arn actually got any long-form offense in the entire match up until the last 3 minutes when Nikita eventually posted himself. There were flashes of moments where the heels would temporarily have things under their control, but it was basically an 80-20 ass beating where Sting and Nikita just dominated these guys. It was funny seeing Sting dive over the top rope to take out Double A early on. Fast forward like 30 seconds, Sting's in the ring just cranking on his arm in a stationary hold. No. Even the legends had issues with continuity at times. Big high spot, pop the crowd. Now we're going to work over the arm for a little bit. Again, man, you know, I hate to beat a dead horse when it comes to me talking about the difference between modern versus old school tag team wrestling. But you watch a match like this in 1988, compare what you see today. They're not even in the same stratosphere. Tully and Arn were the embodiment of real tag team wrestling, dude. Everything they did always had a purpose. They always hit their mark. They always knew where to be and how to time their stuff. Now, I'm just going to rattle off a couple things that stood out to me in this match. Something else you don't see that much anymore in tag team wrestling, and it just boggles the mind. The spot where Nikita was being isolated in the heel corner, Arn and Tully were trying to make the quick tag so Tully could get in and then immediately grab a hold of Nikita to prevent him from breaking free. And the moment Arn releases the grasp and Tully gets in there, Nikita retreats back to the babyface corner, creates an even playing field, and Tully just goes, fuck. He got away. That kind of shit stands out. Because you never see it anymore. All the subtle things that make you believe that it's an actual struggle between two opposing tag teams. You know, the story that the announcers put over, Nikita's been scouting his Horseman tapes because he knew exactly what their game plan was going to be here. I did love the spot where Nikita just hit Arn and Tully with a Russian sickle less than 5 minutes in. I mean, the crowd blows a gasket because they're all like, holy shit, he just hit his finish. And then Nikita wastes precious time kowtowing to the fans before he goes over to cover the heels. Arn has enough time to get his foot under the bottom rope. And the crowd's like, shit. Again, though, no wasted motion from either team. Sting and Nikita had an answer for virtually everything the heels tried to do, up to and including the cheating tactics. And then we get the turning point. Nikita finally decks Arn with a sickle for a second time. Both guys take a tumble out to the floor. And Nikita manages to get Arn in the ring to get him in a pinning predicament. And right as the ref's coming down to count the three, that goddamn J.J. Dillon, he pulled at Nikita's foot, halted the momentum. And that leads to the best moment in the entire match, where Nikita goes out to stalk JJ. And of course, JJ has his back turned, so he's trying to pretend like he didn't do anything wrong. He's looking up at the ceiling, checking his fingernails, whistling to himself, just being the ultimate scumbag. And when he turns around and sees Nikita snarling in his face, we get that classic, I just shit my pants JJ expression. And Nikita grabs him by the scruff of the neck, drags him over to the ring post. He's about to level him with the sickle, and bam! JJ ducks. Nikita clotheslines the ring post, takes a comically bad bump on the concrete. But now the heels have a break, and they have a chance to get some actual heat here while they have the advantage. So they're working over Nikita while he's trying to fight back and get Sting back in there to make the save. We end up with all four guys in the ring as they're counting down the final few minutes. Sting's in there hitting all his signature offense. He gets Tully in the corner with the Stinger Splash. Nikita's trying to fend off Arn. And right as Sting gets Tully trapped in the Scorpion Deathlock, you see Tully flailing his arms around. Arn's doing all he can to help save his fellow comrade. And eventually the bell sounds, and it signals the time limit draw right at the 20-minute mark. And the babyfaces are celebrating, thinking they just won the straps. But the story here is that Tully never quit before the bell sounded. The 3-year storyline continues here as Tully never said the words, I quit. He's living the gimmick all the way through to the end, damn it. He's not a quitter. And of course, this part's great. The babyfaces are parading around with the belts, but the heels are trying to tell the ref to get them back because obviously they didn't win. So Sting and Nikita just say, fuck you, dude. We're taking the belts anyway. And they just leave. So the Horsemen are left standing in the ring playing with themselves. And despite the fact that there was not a title change here, the babyfaces just decided to be sore losers and walk out with the straps anyway. So I take it we'll hear more about this on the upcoming Saturday shows. And going off my track record of hating the storyline in wrestling where the champions have their belts stolen from them, meanwhile management does nothing to try to force the thieves to hand the belts back over. If Jim Crockett does not come out on television and tell Sting and Nikita to give the belts back to the Horsemen, he is both a terrible owner and company president. But yeah, fantastic opener. Crowd was super into it. It's a case where a match went the full 20 minutes to a draw and it never felt long. Just flew by. Very hot start to the Summer Bash event here in Baltimore. I just wish I can say they kept that momentum going through the remainder of the pay-per-view. And from one set of tag team champions, we now shift gears to a completely different set of NWA tag champions. This one is for the United States tag belts. It's the Fantastics defending against the Midnight Express with a couple of added wrinkles and stipulations. As we've been building on television, it is a title versus 10 lashes bout. And also during the match, Jim Cornette would be suspended above the ring in a shark cage, while also being contained in a straitjacket. Because as we all know, whenever you do the gimmick where somebody's hung over the ring in a shark cage during a wrestling match, it never ends in bullshittery. The manager never tries to pass off a gimmick to the heels or anything to help them win, even though the cage is supposed to be there to prevent interference. Yeah, unfortunately, I've been watching wrestling too long. So they milked the straitjacket angle for all it's worth. I think half the entire segment was the referees trying to actually get Corny to cooperate so they could get the jacket around him. Meanwhile, Cornette is audibly asking them, "Can you be bribed?" I will give you $5,000 not to go through with this. I have money. While he's having this pre-match conniption, looking for any excuse not to get locked inside the cage, JR and Shivanto just casually chime in with, pretty emotional moment, isn't it? Another great line from JR as they're raising the cage up. He just goes, I always knew Jim Cornette would go far in the business. Specifically about 40 or 50 feet up in the air. So they do manage to get Corny up in the cage, and he's basically rendered stock still for the remainder of the match. They'd occasionally give you the floor cam shot where he's sitting up there in pretzel position, probably because he was legitimately fearing for his life. So he's like, maybe if I sit still and don't move a muscle, I may make it out of the building alive tonight. And now, of course, I mean, we're talking about the Midnights and the Fantastics here. It's honestly like kind of reviewing a Sting Flair match at this point. We've seen it a million times. It's always a great match. But after seeing so many of them over the years, what do you really say about them at this point? It's natural in-ring chemistry. They always hit their spots fluidly. The Midnights are bumping machines early on. They always do a great job selling for Fulton and Rogers. There was a really stupid spot in this match where Stan Lane accidentally gave Beautiful Bobby an overhead backdrop. Now, the question you're probably asking is, how is that remotely possible? The answer is, it's not. It was very phony. Stan is hunched over. Tommy Rogers goes to whip Bobby towards Stan. And somehow I was supposed to buy that Stan inadvertently used gravity to backdrop his own tag team partner. Or perhaps it was pure instinct that Stan would go to backdrop somebody when they're charging toward him. I mean, I love Bobby and Stan. They're my all-time favorite tag team. But seriously, what the fuck? That spot was ridiculous. They do eventually turn the tables and manage to cut off Rogers. It's the classic heel spot where the Midnights keep illegally double-teaming Rogers. Fulton tries to run in to direct the ref's attention to the cheating, but, while he's arguing with the ref, the Midnights keep attacking Rogers from behind. I did get a kick out of the one spot where Bobby went to cover Rogers while his feet were in the ropes, and if you could picture Bobby's voice in your head during this exact quote, it's perfect. The ref tells him to break up the fall. Bobby Eaton very calmly goes, "Dadgummit, Tommy." Dadgummit. Totally a Bobby Eaton line. So the match is chugging along. We're still getting the occasional camera shots of Corny up in the cage where he basically looks like he's a sitting corpse. This man is paralyzed with fear. Finally, the Fantastics get a hope spot where the Midnights go for the rocket launcher, but Rogers gets the knees up to Eaton. So Fulton's able to get the big tag and run wild for a little bit. And we get this awesome sequence of events in the last few minutes where Tommy Young's playing chicken with the boys and trying to avoid getting leveled. There was a double drop-down spot which had me dying. Eaton shoots Fulton off the ropes, and Eaton goes down on his belly. So to avoid getting run over, Tommy Young sees Bobby Fulton charging toward him. So his instinct is to not dive out of the way. But after seeing Eaton go down, he says, "That's genius. I will now drop down too." So we indeed saw a referee drop-down spot here in 1988 on pay-per-view. Never been seen since. And it did lead to a really critical part of the match here. where Stan grabbed Bobby and slammed him onto the concrete. And they're in there doing some more stuff. Eventually, Young actually does take a bump so the heels can go to the well with their gimmick. Bobby Eaton pulls out a chain, and he goes to wrap it around his wrist while everybody's not looking. And because Fulton was down selling on the floor minutes prior, he was totally caught off guard when he turned around and got clobbered with the chain. And because Bobby Eaton is a genius and a veteran, he knew the babyfaces would try to pitch a fit afterwards. He then disposed of the chain by methodically placing it inside of Bobby Fulton's trunks. So after the heels get the W, and the babyfaces are trying to tell Tommy Young what happened, Young calls Bobby Eaton back into the ring. He temporarily feels around to see if he has a gimmick lodged in his tights. But of course, he doesn't find anything, aside from his junk. So he's like, I don't know what you guys are talking about. And that is when Bobby Fulton reaches into his trunks and he pulls out the chain. And he's like, God damn it. The evidence. They planted it. So the heels walk out unscathed. Well, almost. They did get a modicum of revenge on Corny by trapping him in the ring and briefly strapping him with Tommy Young's leather belt. Which was kind of funny. Fulton's like, Tommy, stand still. Give me your belt. And while Tommy Young is being visibly molested, the babyfaces start teeing off on Corny with his belt. And of course, he had some extra padding with the straitjacket, so probably didn't affect him all that much here. But that is now 2 instances on this show where the babyfaces got fucked. And because they are sore losers, they decided to unload their frustrations on the heels anyway. These are not befitting qualities of normal babyfaces. But the story coming out of it is that the Midnights regained possession of the U.S. tag straps, which is crucial story development, because pretty soon we'll be entering the stage where they start teasing the rumblings of the Midnight Horseman feud that never really gets off the ground because Tully and Arn end up leaving the company before the end of the year, but we don't know that. But at least they got as far as having the managers interact with each other and call the other out on television, so I'm looking forward to that. It was a really great match. Gimmicks and stipulations aside. You know, the babyfaces at least got to whip the annoying heel manager to shut him up, even though they got stiffed. So it's another bittersweet moment on the pay-per-view where the fans don't really get the outcome they wanted, but they at least got to see the heel manager get his comeuppance temporarily. So 2 matches in. Pay-per-view was really cooking by this point. And unfortunately, things kind of fell off a cliff for the next half hour. It is no secret. I've been saying it countless times in the lead up to this pay-per-view. I was never a fan of the Tower of Doom, Doomsday Cage, Triple-Decker Cage, whatever they were calling the gimmick. It went through so many stages over the years. The whole concept of the match just never clicked with me. It was too gimmicky. Kind of reminds me of that stupid Red Asylum cage match that TNA did years ago where, I mean, you couldn't even see what the hell was happening for half the match because the bars were so goddamn thick. This had the problem where you had 3 layers to the cage. For the most part, the whole match was filmed from a wide shot to try to catch everybody in the same frame. But you couldn't really tell or see what was happening for a lot of it. Everybody kind of looked like they were fighting on loose floorboards. Nobody could bump. Everything looked like shit offensively. Because all you could really do was throw some weak-looking punches and kicks. because you're confined to such a small space. And the rules were borderline impossible to follow. It's 3 cage tiers. They have these trap doors that just arbitrarily open at random intervals. And the wrestlers had to climb down to the next layer of the cage before the trap door shut. And the first team to have all their members reach the bottom and get out of the cage win. I guess they win the match and Precious, because she was the person at the bottom of the cage that was going to unlock the final door. So it's all members of the Varsity Club plus the new Powers of Pain versus the Garvins, the Road Warriors, and Dr. Death. Actually, wait. Fuck, no it wasn't. No, it was Sullivan and Rotunda for the Varsity Club. Yeah, that's right, because Al Perez was in there too, and he was wrestling for the heels. Where the fuck was Rick Steiner? I just realized that. I watched this entire match and never even put that together. Well, you know. Guess you could call it that Al Perez syndrome. Kind of forget that numbskull exists half the time. He's such a non-entity. They had the camera shot with Tommy Young climbing this jank-ass looking Home Depot ladder to the top of the cage. The expression on his face was priceless. He's climbing this ladder. It's so wobbly. And you just look at his face the whole time. It just reads, fuck this. They are not paying me enough money to go through this bullshit. I mean, he's up there for what seemingly felt like 15 minutes checking the trap doors to make sure everything's functional. I mean, he looks like he's about to legitimately shit his pants. I don't think he could physically stand up. He was so petrified. And meanwhile, the boys, they're like, here we go, baby. Fuck gravity. If we die, we die. No fear. And trust me, there were moments in this match where I legitimately thought the cage was on the brink of collapsing, especially when the majority of the weight was right at the top of the cage. That first tier was shaking like a motherfucker. I'm just watching Tommy Young on his hands and knees the entire time. Like, he's basically praying for an act of God to get him out of this thing alive. I mean, I'm half kidding when I talk about some of this stuff, but I definitely was not a fan of the match. I didn't like it the first time I ever saw it. I think they redid this match like 10 years later in WCW. It didn't hold up then. It doesn't hold up now. I mean, it's basically a 20-minute match where guys are doing slow, lumbering offense. They did manage to get a couple good camera shots of the action when they got the production guy on the second level of the cage. You could actually see what was happening. But for the most part, the whole thing was basically filmed from a giant wide shot. And you just kind of saw these microscopic bodies falling and moving around in the background. They tried to at least tell a story where the babyfaces were at the numbers disadvantage during the closing several minutes. Although they really didn't even do a great job at that. It was pretty even Steven for the most part. I mean, Ron Garvin was out of there in like 5 minutes. But it ends up boiling down to Sullivan and Jimmy Garvin, which makes sense based on the story they've been telling with those two. And you get the end result where Jimmy plants Sullivan with a brainbuster. He goes to get Precious to unlock the padlock. But Sullivan basically sacrifices the match by pushing Jimmy out to the floor. But he stays in the cage with Precious, so he can spend the next several minutes doing the Night of the Living Dead stalk while the babyfaces are having to climb up the cage to try to make the save. It is the most comically goofy thing you've ever seen, because, you know, the good guys have to slowly climb all the way up this fucking cage just to get back down to the lower tier. And meanwhile, Sullivan has to pretend like he's incapable of grabbing a hold of Precious, and doing God knows what, potentially raping her. He's like slowly crawling and edging closer and closer to her. Precious is trying to fight him off. And eventually Sullivan wraps a fucking chain around her throat and tries to choke her out. I actually wrote down here, man on women violence in 1988 on national pay-per-view. This would also not fly in the year 2024. And, well, the babyfaces do eventually make the save for the damsel in distress. It was very hokey. And, definitely what I would consider the low point of the pay-per-view. And look, I get it. For the time, it was probably a very interesting gimmick concept. But you watch it again with fresh eyes in 2024. I just don't think it holds up. I really don't. I've also hated every minute of the Varsity Club Garvin storyline just because the acting's been hideously appalling. I mean, the idea here that Sullivan was incapable of doing anything to Precious while he had her trapped in the cage for like 2 fucking minutes. That was just ridiculous. I mean, I can buy that Precious would be able to fend for her life, but like Sullivan having to pretend like he was incapable of sequestering her, him doing this over-dramatic slow zombie crawl before he eventually got the chain hooked around her neck. God. Yeah, this is a little too on the nose for my taste. Bad match. Bad payoff. The crowd liked it. I have no idea how. Because it really was not any good. But I guarantee you, you put today's audience in that same building to watch this exact same match, I mean, they'd have been booing that shit out of the building. Probably chanting things like, "We can't see this." Catcalling Precious the entire time. I'm pretty sure this is the blow-off to the feud. So good. Hopefully we can move on from it and put it in the rear-view mirror. So then we come to the U.S. heavyweight title match between Dusty Rhodes and Barry Windham. Although I mistyped it in my notes as Dusty Windham and Barry Windham. So I guess we're calling him Barry Rhodes from here on out, just to keep with the consistency. Coming off the heels of the triple-decker Cage of Doom. Now we're just back to good standard pro wrestling. With lockups. And holds. It was very weird. But you can kind of call this a proving ground match of sorts for Barry. His opportunity to take all that Dusty Windham taught him and use it to his advantage. And the question is, how did he fare? Well, if you bear in mind we're talking about Dusty, he was going to make Barry work for that victory. That's for sure. He threw everything but the kitchen sink at him. And in fact, Dusty got hit with a kitchen sink at the very end in the form of Ron Garvin's right hand. Not to get ahead of myself. So, well, it actually kind of followed a similar pattern as the other Horseman match we saw. Barry essentially spent 70% of the match getting his ass kicked. Just couldn't muster up any long-term offense to keep Dusty vulnerable. He had multiple spots where they would fight out to the floor, and Barry's just taking back bump after back bump on the concrete. Backdrops, body slams, the whole 9 yards. I mean, that guy had to be a hurting unit by the end of this show. So Dusty's in there just kicking his ass. Crowd's going ballistic for everything he does. Finally, they do a distraction spot with JJ so Barry could lock in the claw hold. And remember the comment I just made about how Dusty made Barry earn that victory? Barry had that claw hold on Dusty for a long, long time. I think when they were putting this match together, Dusty said, "I'll put you over, brother, but I'm going to keep fighting out of this claw hold and make it last. Put it on me for 5 minutes and let me fight, daddy, before I go down in flames," you know what I'm saying? Barry's just squeezing on Dusty's head for what seemingly had to be an hour. I think runtime for this pay-per-view was somewhere around 2.5 hours. I think an hour and 45 minutes of this pay-per-view was Barry putting Dusty in this fucking claw hold. And they're doing the dramatic arm drop sequence where Dusty's losing steam. He's trying to keep the arm up before the third count. He gets his momentary flashes of life where he starts shaking his hips and soaking in the fan reaction to power up. But then Barry would cut him off again. And they finally do the spot where Dusty drops an elbow over Barry from the top rope. Barry inadvertently collides with Tommy Young, so he goes down. And Dusty eventually throws Barry off the top with a power slam. Hits an elbow drop for a visual pin. But Tommy's still down selling. And I guess Earl Hebner was taking a piss break or something, so he couldn't make the call. And that leads to the climax point, where for reasons that did not really make much sense on paper and still do not to this day, other than to apparently swerve the audience, we get a very capricious heel turn from Ronnie Garvin, where he casually strolls into the ring, blindsides Dusty with a knockout punch, and, well, then Barry just locks in the claw on Dusty, and Tommy Young counts the pinfall. You know, after Dusty had already been rendered unconscious. So, I mean, I've already spoiled the Ron Garvin heel turn multiple times. And I did so because I regret to inform you, it never leads anywhere. We do not get an actual payoff to this heel turn. Now, this is hypothetical. I believe the idea was to initially align Garvin with Gary Hart. You obviously had the history between Garvin and Wyndham where they were babyfaces back in '87 going after the U.S. tag titles. I presume the game plan would have been to form some kind of alliance between Gary Hart and the Horsemen where Ron Garvin would kind of act as the middleman. Not really being a full-fledged Horseman member, but kind of hanging out in the background and doing the dirty bidding for everybody. Which they kind of set up in the segment later on where Ronnie's seen collecting the payout from Gary Hart in the back. But all of that went into the shitter when Garvin left the company before the end of the summer. For reasons that I don't really know off the top of my head. Management dispute? Could have been. Getting stiffed on pay? Potentially. Him having a blowout with Dusty? Not entirely unfeasible. Whatever the reason was, it was just kind of an incomplete story. So it's hard to really judge it because we don't really know what the end game was. I imagine it would have led to some kind of grudge match between Dusty and Ronnie later on in the year. Perhaps for Starrcade. Instead of that last-minute Road Warriors heel turn that didn't really go anywhere either and completely killed off Hawk and Animal. Yeah. The wheels are coming unhinged with Dusty's run. From this point up until January of '89, it is a downhill spiral from a booking standpoint. Everything Dusty does from basically the summer of '88 until his abrupt departure in January when he gets fired, it's not really all that good. And this, I think, was just the tip of the iceberg. But with all that said, we have one more thing to talk about on this show. And I've been giving you the slow burn tease for weeks now. The match that I deemed killed Lex Luger's career. Killed. Dead in the water. It was over. Okay. Am I being overdramatic? In some ways, yeah. This didn't kill Luger's career necessarily, although it really didn't do anything to help his babyface run in '88. That's for damn sure. But we have arrived. The long-awaited showdown between Luger and Flair for the World Heavyweight Championship. A story that dates all the way back to when the Horsemen kicked Luger out of the group. Barry turned on Luger as a partner, took his place as the fourth Horseman, and Luger's been waiting with bated breath to finally get his hands on the top champion. And they've done everything possible to give you the impression, based on the build, based on the story, based on the track record of everything since his debut in '87, this was Luger's crowning night. You watch the television shows, you see what they've been doing on the television product. Everything seemed like it was leading to this moment. And even if the title reign was short, at least people would get that cathartic payoff. Getting to see Luger topple the most dominant world champion of the '80s, maybe even start to elevate and create a new top babyface to carry the company into the new regime. It would have been impeccable timing. Well, then the match happened. I mean, it's hard to even gauge where you begin here, but there's so much to unpack. I mean, in terms of the layout of what the guys did, I mean, it followed very similar patterns to what you saw in the Sting-Flair match from the Clash of Champions back in March. And or every Sting-Flair match in existence. Luger just physically overpowered Flair from start to finish. Flair gave Luger everything to make him look like $1 million. The idea was to make him look like Superman. The polar opposite booking of what WWF did with Luger in 1995, where he was out there selling for 99% of the match and relying on the British Bulldog to make the save in their tag matches. But you had a lot of elements pulled from the Flair matches with Sting and Barry Windham and Ronnie Garvin. Babyface no-selling chops, press slamming Flair all over the ring, Flair bumping around like a pinball. Of course, then you realize you're 5-10 minutes into the match and they barely done jack shit. That's the magic of Ric Flair matches. But yeah, for the most part, Luger was firmly in control. I believe we counted 4 overhead press slams by the end of the match. Not that anybody was actually counting. Tony Schiavone. I do have to point out one specific moment on commentary that left me floored when I first heard it. When I went back and listened to it again, I was so disappointed when I found out I completely misheard the original comment. There was a spot where Flair cut off Luger with a stiff right to the jaw. A closed fist, to coin a technical term. And as we know, that is very much frowned upon in the world of wrestling. Or at least it was once upon a time. Tony Schiavone made a comment about it. And when I first heard him, I legitimately thought he said the following statement. Tommy Young warning Flair about fisting himself. And I stopped the video because I was like, dear God in heaven, there's no way Schiavone just said that out loud. So I rewound it. I listened again. What he actually said was Tommy Young warning Flair about using the fist himself. And I was like, oh, okay, well, that's different. Those are completely different schools of thought. I'm glad to know that Ric Flair did not fist himself on live pay-per-view. I just want to let you all know, yes, my brain is wired that way. I also want to call this out for the record. This bullshit over-the-top DQ rule that just seems to fluctuate depending on the circumstance. I am so sick of hearing the announcers use the momentum excuse. Oh, his momentum carried him over the top rope. Therefore, it will not count as a DQ. Can somebody explain to me what the fuck that even means? His momentum? It happened twice on this show where somebody was clearly clotheslined over the top rope to the floor, and the ref just shrugged it off like, oh well, the match is going to continue because I say so. It was during the opener with Tully and Arn versus Sting and Nikita. I think it was the spot where Nikita took Arn out to the floor. Same exact deal. The ref saw it. And the announcers are like, oh, no, there's momentum. The match has to continue. It was gravity's fault. Fuck off. Flair did work over Luger in the figure four for a little bit. He targeted the knees several times throughout the match, which I think Luger actually forgot what leg he was supposed to sell at one point. He's not the first guy in wrestling to do that. I don't know why that's so hard. You have two knees. Figure out which one you're supposed to be selling. And everything, I would say, is going along swimmingly. And as the old cliche goes in wrestling, certainly when you're talking about WCW, it is going along well until the finish. And this is one of those all-time terrible finishes that just leaves you so sour afterwards. Mainly because it's the kind of heat that backfires on the company in a negative way. It's not the boo, fuck you, Ric Flair heat. It's the boo, fuck you, NWA, and fuck you, Crockett kind of heat. The bad company heat. Which is exactly what it was. Flair and Luger both take a bump out to the floor. Flair's selling the knee momentarily before running Luger into the ring post. And while Flair has Tommy Young distracted, JJ grabs a hold of Luger and bounces his head into the ring post again. I believe he was also the one that fed Luger the gimmick so he could blade his forehead. And if you've seen the match, you know what's coming. Luger gets Flair up in the rack, but because of the pap smear that Luger opened up on his forehead, the Baltimore Athletic State Commission steps in. They go over to Tommy Young and have him stop the match. So right as Luger thinks he's won the strap, and all the baby faces empty out from the back to celebrate with him, we are then told that Ric Flair retains the title via ref stoppage. And it's just one of those moments where you read the room, everybody's going ballistic, they're throwing babies in the air. It's the biggest fucking reaction on the entire pay-per-view. And the minute that announcement is made that Flair retained the title, oh, it sucked the air out of the room. It killed the crowd. Just, and not in a good way either. Not in a way where you want to see Luger get his revenge on Flair. Because, again, keep in mind, spoiler alert for those following in our timeline here, but it is very important when we're talking about the Luger-Flair program in '88. They do end up rematching Flair and Luger at Starrcade at the end of the year. And you just think, okay, well, knowing you're going to rematch them anyway, why couldn't you just have Luger beat Flair for the title here? If you absolutely need to put the belt back on Flair, which was the eventual plan, you can just have Luger drop it back at Starrcade. It's not that big a deal. We've seen plenty of short title reigns. Fuck, they did it with Ron Garvin last year. Did you really need to cut off Luger's balls like you did here? It was so fucking stupid. And again, it did not generate the right kind of crowd heat. It was such a black and blue mark for the company here. Because I really do believe this is where the fans lost faith in Luger ever being taken seriously as a top main eventer in WCW. The moment you had Luger lose this match, it was over for him. He never recovered after this. Meanwhile, the announcers are having to sit there going, well, the fans are clearly upset about the call. You think? Christ, I'm surprised they didn't set the goddamn building on fire before they left. What a stupid finish. This moment right here, I truly believe people do not talk about this enough. When you talk about all-time catastrophic pay-per-view finishes, this had so many long-term bad ramifications for the company. It really was like the final nail in the coffin right before the Turner sale. I'm surprised at how this particular match is glossed over by so many experts when, you know, people talk about all-time bad pay-per-view finishes. And like, the match itself is fantastic. The wrestling is great. The backstory is remarkable. But the finish is what counts. And they screwed the pooch on this one 6 ways from Sunday, dude. I don't know. I don't know where the '88 Bash Tour ranks among the all-time WCW pay-per-views. I didn't really think all that highly of the card. The first 2 matches are outstanding. Tower of Doom wasn't my cup of tea. Dusty and Barry was fine. The finish was disappointing because we never really got a follow-up with the Ron Garvin heel turn. But in the main event, it's one of those matches where you cannot overlook the bad finish. Wrestling aside, everything Luger and Flair did in the ring, for the most part, it was really damn good. But that finish, man, fuck that finish. I mean, I can't really say it ranks among the all-time great Bash pay-per-views, especially when the final thing we see are the fans basically flipping the bird to the company for stiffing them on a really good world title match. And they were already stiffed in 4 of the other 5 matches on the card. Think about that. They got stiffed on the World Tag Title match. They got stiffed on the U.S. Tag Title match. Although they did get to see Corny get strapped for like 5 seconds. But then they got stiffed in the U.S. Heavyweight Title match. And they got stiffed in the World Title match. 4 out of the 5 matches. The heels went over. God almighty. I mean, it's really hard to have a positive outlook regardless of how good the match quality is. And I know that's a common problem with internet marks these days, putting way too much emphasis on the ring work and not enough emphasis on the booking or the logic. That's why AEW is in the damn shape that it's in. Maybe it's just the cynical side of me talking, but I have a hard time going back and seeing this show and praising it. I know the 88 Summer Bash did record business for Crockett. It was sort of their chance to turn things around and get back in good graces with the network. But they were in such a financial hole, on top of the bitter taste it left in everybody's mouths. Did not do them any favors as we led into the fall. It's unfortunate. They had megastar power up and down the card. Some really great action in the first couple matches, too. But I think this is where Dusty's critics as a booker really come to the forefront. Just one terrible Dusty finish after another. And it was a trend throughout all of 88. I mean, you can occasionally give people the incentive to want to see the babyface get his revenge. But you do that shit over and over and over and over again. Eventually, the people just say, fuck it, we're done. We don't care. We're not going to buy a ticket. We're not going to go see the live events. What's the incentive? We know we're going to get screwed. We know we're not going to get the end result we want. And I think that's kind of where we are in the summer of 88. The fans have seen it. They're tired of it. And now they're over it. So for Midsouth TV this week, we are wasting no time diving into the action. And the commentators were so excited to get things rolling, they didn't even bother with the intros. Just said, folks, got a lot of great action this week. Fuck the story follow-up. Let's go see some dudes grapple. And they really got my blood pumping to see some great technical action. I was like, man, they must have a real banger of a match waiting in the ring right now. It is Ralph Williams and Doug Vines versus Johnny Rich and Magnum TA. Not quite the banger I was hoping for. I was just curious to find out whether or not this Ralph Williams fella had any relation to Ralph Vaughan Williams, the famous composer. I do not believe that was the case. I did very much enjoy the last 30 or so seconds. You get all four guys in there fighting in the corner. They do the double bonk spot with the job guys to set up a series of double team moves, including Magnum and Johnny executing a horribly timed double drop kick that would bring a tear to the Rock and Roll's eyes. And then Magnum gives the one dude his atomic drop, followed by a quickly executed belly-to-belly for the 3 count. I believe that may be the first time we've actually seen Magnum hit the belly-to-belly on TV. And there was like no transition. It looked like total instinct here. Thinking on his feet, Magnum's like, this atomic drop finish kind of sucks. I know. I'll just turn the man around and throw him over my head. And that'll be my new finish. And so the Magnum TA belly-to-belly finish became a thing. I mean, this was more of a showcase piece for him. I think Johnny Rich was sort of the designated placeholder partner for the week. That poor guy. He feels so bad for him. He gets those 2 big wins over the Rat Pack, and now he's just certified jobber for life. And from there, we came back to get a look at some Houston footage. Paul Bosch had sent tape over to Watts to approve the airing of a Dusty Rhodes Nick Bockwinkel bull rope match from the Sam Houston Coliseum. It's a pretty big deal. I believe Bockwinkel was still the AWA champion at the time. And we also had Dusty narrating the commentary, which is fucking awesome. If for any other reason, me getting to listen to Dusty call him Nicky Bockwinkel, and the whole time, he's giving you the Dusty spin, not even trying to be an impartial commentator. And he's the American Dream coming in hot, giving you everything he has, Daddy, because he wants that AWA World Championship. But not as much as he wants to see you bleed. You know what I'm saying? And, like, of course, the best moment in the whole thing, the underlying story here is that Bockwinkel apparently tried to hire Ted DiBiase and King Kong Bundy to take out Dusty here. But the plan backfired, if you will. All we see is this great camera shot where Dusty clocks Bockwinkel over the head with a cowbell. And then from literally out of the fucking rafters, DiBiase drops down and tries to attack Dusty mid-pinfall. Dusty just casually gets up and says, "Not today, Daddy. Woo! The American Dream giving you that receipt as I crack that cowbell over your skull." And while Dusty's fighting back on the heels and giving him everything he has, Daddy, that's when Bundy shows up and goes after him. And you see Bockwinkel restraining Dusty on the floor by yanking on the bull rope. And then Bundy's driving the tape fist into Dusty's head. "Open up the stitches." And now Dusty wants the tape fist match. "I want you, Bundy. Tape fist match. I want my fists taped up so I can give you them knuckle sandwiches." Direct quote, by the way. Knuckle sandwiches. "And then afterwards, Nicky Bockwinkel, I'm coming for you in the AWA's World Heavyweight Championship." I tell you, man, ain't nobody else like the American Dream. God, this is amazing. If Paul Bosch was the one doing the commentary here, it would have been an entirely different segment. Drier than a nun's cunt, to quote a famous phrase. But like, just getting to hear Dusty, I mean, he was essentially doing a video package to hype up him and Bockwinkel for a rematch later on. Plus a tape fist match with Bundy, apparently. But like, that shit took us from a 2 to like a 9.75. Easily. Love this clip. I wish Dusty would be on Midsouth programming every week calling matches. Just about one match a week for Dusty to fly into Shreveport, call a quick squash. Then he could just leave. Be the best segment on the entire fucking show. But of course, this kind of tied hand in hand with the next match. A 2-on-1 handicap, pinning King Kong Bundy against Jerry Caldwell and Ron Ellis. Beyond it being a basic enhancement squash for Bundy, it was also great because, you know, it kind of starts as a regular handicap match where the job guys are tagging in and out. And then as it keeps going, Bundy essentially gets bored. And he's like, you know, fuck this. I'm just going to beat up both these guys at the same time. And so he demolished both guys simultaneously. Had no problem with it. He ended up planting the one guy on the other with the avalanche power slam. Probably crushing his sternum in the process. It literally looked like a King Kong Carnage massacre. As cliche as that may sound. Not much to really say about it other than Bundy is a very scary man and very strong. The equivalent to water is wet. So then we had actual story recap material for the week. Last week was the Mid-South Tag Title Showdown with DiBiase and Olympia versus JYD and Duggan, which wound up taking a hard turn when Olympia was driven into the ring post during the pre-match brawl. And as a result, King Kong Bundy took Olympia's place for that match. But Watts actually took the time to address the entire timeline. They even showed highlight footage of the angle a couple weeks prior when DiBiase hit the ring during the Rat Pack versus Duggan Johnny Rich match. And remember, that was a segment where Duggan grabbed DiBiase and ran his cast into the corner turnbuckle, and all that plaster went flying into the air like exploding popcorn. But that is also where we figured out that DiBiase was pulling a fast one. He was not injured. The whole broken wrist facade was done so he could avoid having to defend the Mid-South tag belts. So, well, justice was finally served. To some degree. Even though the heel's still technically left with the belts. DiBiase got a bit of comeuppance for having dodged Hacksaw Duggan all those months. And, well, they replayed the match this week in its entirety. Since we already covered the match in detail, I'm not going to break everything down move for move. I still think the big takeaway from that whole segment, aside from all the chaos and the interference to try to get the match thrown out, this was where we finally saw an instance of Duggan coming to Dog's aid when he was in trouble. All those weeks that went by where neither guy would come to the other's aid. Finally, Duggan had enough of the Rat Pack's bullshit. He said, "This is ridiculous. I'm willing to let bygones be bygones with the dog here, despite our checkered past. I'm running off these motherfuckers with my 2x4. If they die, they die." So that was all great. And then we had a fantastic match that followed here. Hacksaw Butch Reed versus Mr. Wrestling 2. Hot damn, what a match. As soon as I saw the graphic for this thing, I was like, fuck yeah, dude. Two bitter, angry brawlers getting into fisticuffs. What more could you ask for? No wasted motion from the opening bell. They immediately went after one another. It's always great when you see two guys throwing soup bones, but it actually looks like they're making contact. They're registering shit. Not like today where everybody's whiffing these god-awful looking forearms and punches. For the record, Jim Cornette and Brian Last had a relatively great Dynamite review the other week, and I was able to find a clip of that BCC Lucha Guys tag match, and good God in heaven, I'm glad I gave up on that shit. What a wretched match. You get the big spot here where 2 misses a running charge in the corner. Reed immediately follows up with a shoulder block, but 2 makes sure he's close enough to the rope so he can get a foot underneath. And they're going back and forth. They end up clocking heads and taking a spill out to the floor momentarily. And then we get the finish where Hacksaw Reed goes right up top and hits 2 with an illegal shoulder block for the automatic DQ. And while I know that might seem stupid, because we've seen countless matches where guys come off the top rope with some kind of move, and most of the time it's not a DQ. Here, they explain that because Reed never actually re-entered the ring prior to climbing to the top, he never officially broke the count. Therefore, it was automatic grounds for a DQ the minute he dived off the top back into the ring. By today's standards, I can understand why people might take issue with that, because nothing makes sense anymore, and guys fight outside the ring more often than they fight inside the fucking ring. But it was good. Reed loses by DQ, but he still winds up leaving on his own 2 feet. Not really worried about winning or losing in this case. I think he was more concerned about setting an example for JYD when those two eventually collide. Have I mentioned how great Hacksaw Butch Reed is as a bad guy? Yeah, he's a pretty phenomenal heel. No offense to AJ. And then following that was Ted DiBiase and Tim Horner. It was an okay little TV match. Another textbook model of why old school territory wrestling needs to be shown to all the youngsters coming up through the business today. God, if developmental heels were forced to sit down and watch Ted DiBiase footage from Midsouth, I think the heels would be the best part of every modern wrestling program. It really doesn't require much effort. Get pissed off when the babyface out-wrestles you early on. Get pissed off when he has you down for a near fall. Stall on the floor and throw a hissy fit. Then just be a jag-off when the fans are giving you a hard time. It's not fucking rocket science. You don't need to take bumps through furniture to get that shit over. So Horner's in there having fun working over DiBiase early on. DiBiase went out and pouted for a minute or so on the floor. Ended up taking control momentarily so Horner could milk a quick comeback. And then he goes for broke at the end. Misses a big diving splash out of the corner. And DiBiase capitalizes with a big running power slam for the 3. Didn't even need to break out the loaded glove for this one. I wish the cutoff point for the show would have been right there. Would have been a great episode otherwise. Unfortunately, they tried to subject us to a Boris Zerkov Junkyard Dog standby. And, that was a critical error. If you are looking for the perfect JYD going through the motions match, I present to you this match. Thankfully, it was not long enough to be absolutely terrible. It was, in fact, just short enough to be moderately bad. Because, you know, Boris Zerkov. The spot that led up to the finish right before the thumper, where Dog is in there giving Zerkov these weak-ass looking grazing shoulder blocks. I think that was the point where every smart fan watching wrestling in 1983 collectively said, "Yep, the Dog has totally phoned it in. He does not give a shit." So yes, that segment happened. Not one of the finer moments of Mid-South in 1983, if I do say so myself. And then, for reasons that I really cannot explain, one of the more bizarre segments I've seen them air in Mid-South, they aired Iron Mike Sharp video footage from a squash match in Houston, Texas. And obviously this would have been taped well before he left for the WWF this year. It was just very odd. Like, they knew Sharp had signed with the World Wrestling Federation. He was already at least a month or two into his run there. I don't really know what the point of it was. Maybe so Bill Watts could try to claim, "Yeah, you know that Iron Mike Sharp guy that went up north to wrestle for the bigger promotion? Well, we had him first. Don't forget that. He was our guy before he signed with the Enemy." Yeah, I don't know. Kind of just seemed like petty promoter bullshit, if you ask me. It also made me laugh, too, because there's no way it wasn't a deliberate attack. They chose to air a match of him where he basically got decimated by Kamala. It's like they were trying to rub it in on purpose. Look at that Iron Mike Sharp getting destroyed by the Ugandan giant. Fuck you, Sharp. Yeah, this is random and bizarre. A questionable way for them to end the program this week. I mean, I'd say you could turn the show off after the DiBiase Horner match, and you'd really have a hard time finding an issue with this one. Now, granted, the middle chunk was mostly replay footage of the previous week's big tag match, but the action was a lot of fun. Got a nice balance between babyface and heel showcases this go-around. I like that they're starting to ramp up the excitement for JYD and Hacksaw Reed. I mean, that's really the big program they're building toward for the upcoming Superdome show. God, the people are clamoring for it. I'm still clamoring for Dusty Rhodes commentary on Mid-South, but, we all know it's a wet dream. Still, would have been pretty dang awesome. So, yeah, about that world-class show. Well, on the one hand, we are starting to see a little bit of Star Wars footage trickle in. It's not a traditional airing of all the matches segmented over a couple weeks. This is more so them airing one big feature for the week, and the rest of the show is just regular Dallas Sportatorium programming, which was fine, I suppose. Not that a good old standard episode of World Class is a bad thing. It's just, I kind of want to talk about some interesting things of note. You know what I mean? Instead of just boring TV matches. I don't know where we are in the taping schedule by this point. A few weeks ago, it was the Cornette Sunshine program. A couple weeks back, it was the Von Erichs and Gino and Chris getting the focal attention. Last week, I think it was Mike Von Erich and the Iceman that took up a good portion. That god-awful, horrendous Mike Von Erich promo that absolutely died a death. So they were definitely splicing up the big feuds and trying to space them out over a series of a couple weeks. I guess you would just kind of call this show a hybrid of stuff. They aired the Gino Chris versus Kevin Carey match from Fort Worth, which we'll talk about a bit later on. The stuff they mainly focused on in Dallas, though, I have to think a lot of it was just leftover material from the final taping block before Star Wars. Opener was a tag match, pinning Jack Victory and Rip Oliver against the Fantastics. And I guess we were in the part of the taping block where Jim Cornette got to sit this one out. Which, I mean, considering the history with the Fantastics and the Midnights earlier in the year, it's kind of surprising not seeing him out there. I also determined this may have been the part of the taping block where everybody collectively decided we're going to put the least amount of effort possible into our matches. I counted at the beginning here. From the time the bell rang until the very first lockup in the match, approximately 3 minutes had passed. 3 minutes. And you may be wondering, well, what the hell were they doing for the first 3 minutes if they weren't wrestling? Apparently pulling from the playbook of Goldberg and Brock Lesnar about 20 years prior. There was a story going on at the beginning where Rip Oliver was kind of being a chicken shit and not wanting to lock up with Bobby Fulton for whatever reason. So they just kind of stood there and they gawked at each other for a while. Then Oliver tagged in Victory. At which point, Fulton and Victory proceeded to gawk at each other for a hot minute. More time passed. The only thing that's been happening at this point is a series of Mexican standoffs. And they do like one shoot-off spot in the ropes. Fulton then immediately takes a powder out of the ring and goes to high-five a bunch of fans in the crowd. Finally, I just said, these guys are either trying to conserve energy for something completely unnoted, or they're being lazy on purpose. Then eventually they started doing some stuff. The match kind of picked up at that point. The Fantastics were doing some comedy spots to fuck with the heels. They were doing the old switcheroo in and out tag swaps behind David Manning without him kind of noticing, just clapping their hands together. But they would keep exchanging quick arm wringers on Rip in the process. And every time Manning would ask for a confirmation if they tagged, the crowd would either cheer or scream to the top of their lungs, "Of course they illegally tagged! They're baby faces, you silly goose. They wouldn't cheat." So that was kind of fun. Watching the heels get more visibly frustrated that they couldn't outsmart these two. The crowd really was the centerpiece to this whole thing because they absolutely loved Tommy and Bobby. Anytime there was tomfoolery going on, people were all screaming and trying to get David Manning's attention. Like, even though the babyfaces controlled about 70% of the action here, the heels did eventually get their heat back by cutting off Bobby later on and working him over. And it ends up with all four guys getting into a brawl. Rip ends up dumping Bobby Fulton over the top rope right in front of David Manning. So he then calls for the bell and grants the match of the babyfaces here. And the heels did briefly try to target Rogers while they had the advantage, but they quickly got sent packing. Decently long opener. I mean, it went well over 15 minutes by the end. Maybe that accounted for why they were stalling early on, because they knew they had a lot of time to work with. It was fine. I actually don't know offhand if the Fantastics are even booked for the Star Wars card. So I really don't know how this ties in with anything story-related. I have to imagine they'll at least work a prelim match. Beyond that, though, not a whole lot to say. They're over like wildfire, as we always talk about with these reviews, but I mean, their booking since the Midnight program has been so lackluster. I know they're still not around for much longer, but God, it's hard going back and seeing footage of the Fantastics when they were just a generic mid-card team. Well, that's world-class booking in a nutshell right there. So then we had a really nice little clip here. They took a few minutes to dedicate time to the David Von Erich Memorial Playground for Crippled Children, which I believe used to be stationed in Dallas. I think I read somewhere recently the playground doesn't exist anymore, but the hospital, I think, is still up and running. So Mercer went and met with the director of development at the hospital. She kind of explained what the objective was with building the playground for the kids. It was done for therapy purposes to get them more involved and try to direct them to physical activity, get them outdoors and give them a chance to build strength. It was cool hearing the money they collected to put this together came from local proceeds only. Nothing was government funded. It was all community-based. Which goes to show how influential the Von Erichs were to the local Dallas community. Like their willingness to play a part in getting this project up and running. It's a shame the playground doesn't actually exist anymore. I always like when they do stuff like this, though. You know, pro wrestling companies never take advantage of stuff like this, and it's really a shame. I mean, I get it's a different climate, different culture these days, but I mean, you think with WWE and their love of sponsorships, Well, I mean, most of those dealings are shady to begin with. I'm always more optimistic when I see these smaller, more local businesses earn their money through community and volunteer help. It makes it seem more authentic when you don't have to rely on government money to filter in. Because then you're dealing with a bunch of unnecessary red tape, and you have no idea where half that money even goes to when it's being collected. I think most of the time it gets filtered back into bullshit government programs that don't actually help the cause. But what do I know? That's just me spouting my right-wing conspiracy theories again. No, actually, it's me being skeptical of anything government-funded. Because they lie to us about virtually every goddamn thing. I'm not even going to bring up the beer bug incident. So fast forwarding to Fort Worth, Texas. This is where we saw the tape of the Kevin and Kerry versus Gino and Chris match. And they pretty much aired the whole thing here. And they may have shaved off a few minutes at the beginning, but we saw a good portion of everything that went down. And what a spectacle this turned out to be. I will immediately spoil things by letting you know right now, Mark Lawrence was the star stud of this entire performance. His commentary won me over on this one. He was in full-fledged mark-out mode for this thing. I guarantee you they did not smarten him up to any of this. Everything that came out of his mouth here was completely genuine. Nothing sounded phony. At one point, he was actually calling the action. He openly admitted to being so nervous about the conditioning of the Von Erichs. He said that it was hard for him to actually comment because of the quote-unquote high stakes, which I do not believe there were any to begin with. If you remember, the Von Erichs were the ones that challenged Gino and Chris to the match. But that was all there was to it. I mean, you could call it a grudge match if you want, considering everything that happened dating back to the Parade of Champions, but were there actually any stipulations to this match? I don't believe so. I think it was just a standard tag match. But everyone worked hard. It was super heated. People were going nuts for just about everything. I'll call more attention to the finish in just a sec, because that's where the bulk of the talk stems from here. There was a spot here where I legitimately feared for Kerry's safety. He and Gino fight out to the floor at one point. And if any of you are familiar with those old school barricades at these venues back in the day, they were not like the padded ring barricades you see nowadays. They were singular ropes tied to a base post at various ends of the building. Kerry and Gino end up tussling over this rope at one point. And I think they knocked over one of the bases. So you just kind of see this rope free floating in the air. Somehow this rope gets tangled up in between Gino and Kerry. And Kerry's throwing these punches down on Gino's face while the rope is essentially tied around Kerry's fucking neck. Like you see at one point, Kevin actually has to run over to try to untangle before these guys inadvertently hang themselves. I have no idea how this did not end in catastrophe. Kerry didn't give a shit. He's just wailing on Gino. He's got this rope tied around his neck like a goddamn noose. I'm like, dude, unhook the rope from around your neck. What are you doing? And that was only part one of the near-death experience in this match. Because then we fast forward to the end, and all four guys are fighting in the ring. They do the ref bump spot where Kevin accidentally bumps David Manning. And this had to be unintentional because with the way Mark Lawrence sold it, there's no way they actually pre-planned that. David tries to flip himself over the top rope, but he mistimes it. So fucking David's trapped in the ropes by his neck. And Mark Lorenz, the quote of the decade, this is by far the most emotional I've ever seen this man on camera. The pastor himself, he sees that a man is visibly dying in front of his eyes. So he goes, "Oh my goodness, David Manning, he's choking." And Mark throws down the headset. The adrenaline kicks in. He makes a beeline for David as fast as humanly possible. He and Rick Hazard, a couple of the other ring techs, they are trying to untangle David's head from the ropes. Poor David is trying not to panic because he legitimately can't free himself. And like we've talked about this on the channel plenty. When you get your head trapped in the ropes by your neck like that, you cannot break free by yourself. You need assistance. And the worst thing you could possibly do is panic. I mean, God, that's how Mick Foley lost his ear all those years ago. He couldn't unhook his neck from the ropes, so he pulled himself through and then ripped his ear out of his head. I mean, a lot of people don't remember what the actual cause of that was. I just love Mark Lorenz's reaction here. "Oh my goodness, he's choking." Again, it is the most passion I've ever heard from Mark on any part of the show. All those times you listen to Milquetoast Mark on these Fort Worth shows, or him doing the ring intros at the Sportatorium, sounded like a watered-down Reeser Bowden. He was not milquetoast in this situation. He saw a man legitimately choking and holding on for dear life and said, "God, don't take him from me now." And of course, while everybody's distracted making sure Manning's not dead, that's when the heels powder Kevin in the face. And then he's down selling so they can both target Kerry. Adams hits him with a super kick. 1, 2, 3. Heels escape by the skin of their teeth. Really, really good tag match. You know, angles and drama with David Manning aside. The action here was fantastic. And again, you know, while I'm still confused about the whole comment about stakes in this match, given there really weren't any, they really made you think this loss mattered. The dynamic duo getting the win here was definitely shocking to the Fort Worth fans. It was great, though. The old school powder spot, all the chaos and bedlam that builds up to the finish. Absolutely no qualms with anything that happened here. And Mark Lorenz is the GOAT. Never forget. So we follow that with an interview of some description. Gary Hart is with his boys, the one-man gang and Killer Tim Brooks. They are here to announce that they are going to be pursuing the six-man tag titles. Gary has not forgotten Texas Stadium. He has not forgotten being humiliated by Fritz and his boys, and having his head shaved in front of all those fans. So he has taken it upon himself to bring in the final hired gun, the final man to fill out the group of thugs. It'll be the Von Erichs defending the World Six-Man Championships against the One-Man Gang, Tim Brooks, and Mark Lewin. Mark Lewin. The Purple Haze? Well, that is an unexpected twist. I actually haven't seen a whole lot of footage of the Purple Haze. I just know he wrestled with Kevin Sullivan in Florida for a period when Sullivan was doing the whole satanic cult leader gimmick. I'm pretty sure Mark Lewin was the Purple Haze in that group. I mean, I never really followed much of his work throughout the 60s and 70s. I think he wrestled for the Sheik in Detroit for a period of time, but yeah, it's another guy that unfortunately predates my wrestling expertise. His career had to have been winding down by this point, because I don't remember seeing that guy pop up in any other territory around this time. But I guess he's here to fill the void of the final slot in whatever Hart's group is called here. This weird conglomeration of biker chain dudes. I did like hearing Brooks channel his inner Tony Khan here by referring to this upcoming match as the greatest six-man of all time. Swear to God, every other word here was him saying how great it was going to be. I was half expecting a Tony the Tiger cameo when this was all done. So then we had Kabuki and Chris Adams in the main event. Another chapter in the battle of these super kicks. Except with actual logic and coherence. And not just video game spamming bullshit like we see from the Beta Bucks and their ilk. In all honesty, there really wasn't much to write about here. It was moderately tame considering the talent involved. Pretty basic back and forth deal. Adams went to work over Kabuki's knees at one point to try to prevent use of the thrust kick, which didn't work anyway because Kabuki caught Adams with one in the corner. And we get the deal where Adams tries to bring in a chair. Kabuki went for a running charge but got tied up in the tree of woe. And right as Adams goes to slide the chair into the ring, he then gets into a tug of war with Sunshine, who, mind you, at one point was winning over Chris Adams. But Adams did eventually obtain the chair. And then Kabuki is able to roll up Adams and get the quick pin. Which at first I kind of rolled my eyes at. I'm like, way to take the piss out of Adams right as he and Gino scored that huge win over the Von Erichs in Fort Worth. The very next segment, he is dropping a pinfall to Kabuki thanks to Sunshine's interference. I mean, he did at least get a modicum of heat back by getting to attack Kabuki after the bell. He also got physical with Sunshine by shoving her to the ground, which Mercer simply reacted to by saying, and I quote, "Well, that wasn't very ladylike." Male-on-female violence back in the 80s really did not trigger a lot of people. Mercer just brushed it off like, another day at the office of Sunshine getting physical with these grown-ass men. But she can hold her own. She's an independent woman. And I kind of forget what happened after that. I think Kabuki ended up wrapping Adams around the ring post several times and going after his knees. So he did, in fact, take the piss out of Chris Adams by the end. Oh, whatever. Fine little main event, but it was not below weight or anything. I was kind of over the show by this point, to be honest with you. Nothing was going to follow that tag match we saw in Fort Worth. But yeah, I take it from this point onward, they'll just keep cycling through whatever footage they can get of the Star Wars event. And we'll just kind of see those matches trickle through. So as we wrap up things, the Monday show is going to be pretty tame. Because I told you all we're going to be taking the SmackDown reviews out of the cycle here. So we'll be covering Retro Raw and Retro NXT. The only thing to keep on the radar for Retro WWF is we got the In Your House pay-per-view coming up in a couple weeks. But I think we're still at least another week or so out from that. So yeah, it'll just kind of be a regular, shorter Monday show. But I think that covers everything. So thanks everyone for watching, and take care. Peace out.